Welcome back to Restless. My name is Father Joseph Gill, priest of the Diocese of Bridgeport, and you've joined us here on Veritas Catholic Network and on your podcast stations, along with Paul, Lauren, and Diane. You know, most of our listeners, well, maybe some of our listeners, have never heard of this document called Humanae Vitae. It was actually kind of an important document, pretty controversial within the confines of the church. It was written by Pope Paul VI. And back in 1968. And so have you guys heard of this document before?
Humanae what?
Yeah, Humanae Vitae. It's Latin for something, for human vitae.
Of human life, perhaps?
Yes, of human life, actually. That is exactly what it means.
Yes, so I heard of this in the spring of 2018 when our friend, former priest here, Father Andy, was planning a conference at the Basilica of St. John the Evangelist. And he said, "Hey, Lauren, are you going to come to our Humanae Vitae conference?" And I said, "What's that?" So I had never heard of it before then, but because of him and because of making room for God's love, Humanae Vitae at 50, on June 23rd in 2018, I learned a little bit about it.
That's right. 2018 was the 50th anniversary of the release of that document.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what's that document all about? I mean, what's the summary?
Diane, you're the studious one.
Diane just finished a study on Humanae Vitae.
There you go.
She doesn't want to display her knowledge yet, but
yeah,
it's in there.
I mean, I think the important thing is kind of going through the timeline leading up to why it was written first. So the Didache, one of the oldest church documents, kind of details the practices of the early church and instructed people sort of against fornication, use of potions, abortion, and everything. So it's important just to know that there was this, the use of contraceptives was condemned and echoed by the early church fathers. And even after the Protestant Reformation, Protestants and Catholics stood united on the question of contraception, but that kind of changed in 1930 with the Lambeth Conference, where, it was kind of agreed that contraception, it was like Anglican bishops essentially, and agreed that contraception was permissible for married couples under limited circumstances.
Which is why I'm really glad we don't vote on our doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because then it changes with the whims of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I mean, so because of that, Protestant communities gradually, one by one, and Orthodox churches kind of began condoning contraception. And it was only really the Catholic Church's teaching that remained unchanged. But there was a lot going on sort of with, and I'm sure we'll get into it, of like just this, argument for concern about overpopulation and the feminist movement kind of demanding more opportunities for women and the sexual revolution and everything, that this really became sort of a contentious issue. And so like sort of in the 38 years, I guess, between the Lambeth Conference and when Humanae Vitae was promulgated, there were a few things that happened. Pope Pius XII, he wrote the encyclical Casti Connubii in 1930 in wake of that conference, and that kind of reiterated the constant church teaching on the beauty of marriage and God's plan for bringing life into the world.
Yeah, that's a really good encyclical, Casti Connubii, if you've ever read it.
Never heard of that one.
No? Yeah, it was like the OG, the original.
So, I mean, and that Paul XII, his teaching was very clear, but it didn't stop Catholics from questioning, sort of. And it got worse in 1960 when the birth control pill was introduced. And so when the Second Vatican Council convened in 1962, I think they, thought bishops would kind of fully address the question, but they didn't. So Pope John the 23rd called for a special commission to examine the questions underlying the use of the pill and to determine if it violated the church teaching. So, and his successor, Pope Paul VI, decided to continue the commission. And, I mean, in summary, in 1963, the commission completed its work and it sent sort of a majority report, minority report, and then a rebuttal. And the majority concluded that the church should change its teaching on contraception, and the minority, insisted that the church couldn't change its teaching. And so Paul VI essentially wrote, Humanae Vitae as kind of a response to the commission and to kind of clarify all of this confusion. But as I'm sure we'll talk about, it's
still confusing.
There's
still a lot of confusion
confused
out
people.
there.
So, and it still confuses people today, I think. So.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is that they actually weren't. They were really discussing whether or not the pill was contraception, because they've always been, opposed to barrier methods. But this was the first time that a real chemical method of contraception was kind of being made public. So there was a question like, well, there seems to be still a natural act, right?
And what's the morality of this?
Right. That's the question.
Exactly. And I think Pope Paul VI, he wanted to like refocus the conversation on like the vocation and mission of the human person, whereas, some of the questions surrounding contraception had been kind of about, he wanted it to be about like who we are and not just what we can do, like scientifically and all of that. And he talks a lot, he really goes into how like we're made in the image and likeness of God, and like what is married love and what is responsible parenthood, and just the morality of acts and things like that. So
that was one of the great contributions of the 20th century, I think, from the church, was kind of this humanistic Christian humanism that really came about. It was like, we're not going to talk about morality necessarily from the perspective of a legal code. It's not just God giving us random laws, but rather what fulfills the human person, what makes the human person happy. And this encyclical really comes from that point of view of saying, what are we made for? Mm-hmm. And I think John Paul II goes off on that with his theology of the body too, which kind of takes Humanae Vitae and goes to a whole new depth. And we're going to have a huge episode on theology of the body in the future, so I won't give that away. But Paul, have you ever studied this or heard?
Yeah, I've read the encyclical, and certainly, I think it's really important. I know Diane touched on it, but it's really important to talk about what was going on in the world at that time. And of course, Diane mentioned a sexual revolution and feminism, all that, but it really was, especially post-World War II Europe, if you look at what was, because we always think about things from the United States perspective, but really in Europe, if you look at post-World War II, that's when they had their first massive exodus from the Catholic Church at the time, and really just churches, and it could be Protestant churches too, and how that affected the way people viewed, and they started to move away from the traditional views on sexuality and relationships between men and women. And Europe's usually 10 years ahead of the United States. So if you think of what happened in the 70s in the US, it was happening in the 60s in Europe.
Yeah.
And so when we think about the church's response, it's, I think from a US perspective, I think a lot of people would be surprised that this was such a big issue in the 60s, late 60s in the United States. But it had actually already been, because it felt like it was more beginning at that time.
Well, maybe. I mean, the Summer of Love was 1979. It's 1969.
Yeah.
That was Woodstock and all that jazz. And
yeah, but if you think about 10 years before that, that was Europe,
Was it really?
Not as hippies and stuff, but that's when it started really in Europe. So
yeah.
And that's when it was certainly was starting to reach its peak in the United States at the time.
I've often wondered, and I don't have an answer for it, but why did the sexual revolution catch on so quickly and so everywhere? We went from the 50s where families were intact, it seemed, and it seemed like everyone was brought up in a good Catholic school. Catholic schools were filled, vocations were filled, and then 10 years later, the world fell apart. How did it happen so fast?
Yeah, I think part of it from the European perspective has to do with the collapse of regimes that happened. I mean, it started in World War I, actually, when you had the first collapse of regimes, and then they were rebuilt, and then they were collapsed again in Europe. And then you had this modern wave of, in the United States, when we think about it, and that's why we're generally 10 years behind, is that even though we had our wave of revolution back in the late 1700s, it was still based in faith, right? I mean, it might be loose. It's like Scott Hahn says in his recent book, like it's loose and it's not really great, but it is. It was based in faith. But after you had this wave after the 1940s, when we had basically all of Europe obliterated and rebuilt into the modern kind of like democratic or parliamentary process that really hadn't taken hold in Europe too strong before then, maybe in France, you had this idea that wasn't based in faith. It was based in complete secular. I mean, even you can brush the Declaration of Independence off in the United States, but it did set us up for pretty well for 150 years or so. So that wasn't the case though in Europe.
Well, the Enlightenment. So I mean, you could trace it all the way back to then, and that's because that was the beginning of the collapse of faith in Europe.
Certainly in Europe, yeah.
The Enlightenment, and it came a little bit to the United States, but I think we had a deeper root.
We did, yeah, because it was founded on religious freedom and Christianity.
In college, our professors would always say, ideas have consequences. Mm-hmm. There's no philosophy that just stays in the classroom. It always spills out into the streets. And we're seeing the effects of some of that bad philosophy today. Philosophy that goes back hundreds of years. So when Humanae Vitae came out to reaffirm the church's tradition and teaching, what was the reaction of people?
Well, from what I understand, this was 1968, right? And so birth control the hormonal form was around for 8 years at that point, and the public and the priests assumed that the Catholic Church would adopt this as acceptable for use. So it was already kind of, just rolled out. And then this totally reversed the perception, which I think had a really negative impact on priests, married couples, public at large, and then a reverberation like back to the church in and of itself. Diane, would you agree with that?
Yeah, so I mean, immediately after the publication in 1968, the person who was chosen to present the encyclical to the world, I think his name is Monsignor Fernando Lambruschini. I'm butchering his name, but go with it.
I think that was my appetizer last night.
Yeah, it sounds like an Italian dinner or something. So he voted with the majority in the commission and to change church teaching. And he kind of told the press that the encyclical was not an infallible pronouncement, which kind of encouraged the growing dissent, allowing people to think that, like, Humanae Vitae was just the Pope's personal opinion. And there was another American theologian. His name was Father Charles Curran.
Oh, Father Charles.
I'm probably saying his name wrong again.
Famous guy.
Yeah. So he held a press conference, I think it was 24 hours after the release, and he announced that he had a letter of protest signed by like 86 other theologians, and then within a week it grew to like 200 other priests. But I think Paul VI, saw the dissent coming, and that's why he, in Humanae Vitae, he kind of includes a call to priests to fulfill their responsibilities to teach and preach the truth. But for the next 10 years, I think the church struggled to make sort of a compelling case. And then in 1978, when John Paul II became Pope, Theology of the Body, which Father Joseph touched on, he presented that as part of his Wednesday audiences. And I think that helped people, but I mean, like we talked about, there's still confusion today about sort of some people just don't know what the church's teaching is, and some people know and choose to reject because it's moral. I mean, it's the issue of moral relativism of and
because it costs a great deal.
Yeah, it does.
It's a real sacrifice.
It is a sacrifice
to follow Humanae Vitae, especially when everyone around you is not doing it. Yeah, I remember hearing that in Washington, D.C., a number of priests, I just actually looked it up on Google, a number of priests, I think it was 19 priests, publicly dissented. They signed an open letter in the Washington Post, and the cardinal at the time basically said, you guys can no longer be public priests. And so they took the case all the way to the Vatican, and the Vatican ruled against the cardinal and said, no, you have to reinstate them.
Interesting.
Yeah, they said it wasn't enough of an offense to be worthy of basically removing your faculties, removing your ability to be a priest.
But that certainly set a precedent, right? I mean, and then, I don't know, it just complicates the whole history of it all and the whole adoption of sticking to what the church teaches, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just an echo of that now. I find it funny that, because recently we had the church come out, the Vatican published a thing and says, no, we can't bless same-sex unions, which is kind of a continuation of it's just
that shouldn't be surprised,
right? But the world is shocked. It's like, oh, the Catholic Church actually believes Catholic things. What a surprise! It's like that's why it's always shocking, and maybe we see a little bit of that with some of the German bishops right now too. It's like,
yes,
which is a whole other issue, but there is dissenters out there, I guess, even within the church, which is
it confuses.
It's confusing.
Confuses the church's teaching. Yeah.
And on that most recent topic, I saw an article that was like, this is the last straw. It was like, the writer's perspective. And that ruling was, I guess, there was no reason for this man to stay in the church after hearing this. And yet, like you said, this is the church teaching of 2,000 years.
Right.
So how could this be the last straw right now in 2021?
I mean, we just have to look at, the liberal mainstream Protestants to see how well it works when you adapt your teaching to the zeitgeist, to the spirit of the age. Mm-hmm. Are they thriving and flourishing? No. I mean, mainstream Lutherans and Presbyterians and Methodists are losing members, shuttering churches left and right because they're indistinguishable from the culture.
Right. And also, they've also splintered themselves. Like the big split in the United States was the Presbyterian movement, where you had this giant split in the Presbyterian church between the liberal side and the conservative side.
Sure.
and people, start moving churches and things. And
Well, the Methodists are actually kind of at that point right now.
Oh, really?
In terms of schism because of the gay marriage issue. Because they actually have a synod, a Methodist synod every 4 years to vote on what they're going to believe for the next 4 years. Which, just judging by American elections, you say voting is not always the best to find the truth,
But and then can you just clarify for everyone, what does the Catholic Church teach about, the dignity of a human person as a homosexual?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, we've always taught that every human being is worthy of God's love. Every human being is created in his image and likeness, but that marriage is a very specific and unique relationship that's meant to be for a man and a woman and open to life. And so for that reason, it's not possible to have something like a gay marriage because God has already defined what marriage is. And that's not discrimination against anyone. We're just recognizing the truths that God wrote into the very flesh and blood of what it means to be human. So definitely, I mean, it's just another offshoot of that sexual revolution. Because when you detach sexuality from reproduction, then all of a sudden any kind of sexuality is kind of open for acceptance.
Certainly, we have seen that happen.
We certainly have. We certainly have. And Pope Paul VI, I think, was a real prophet in Humanae Vitae because he said that if contraception became widespread, there would be devaluing of women, general moral decline, and destruction of marriage, and that contraception would soon be mandatory and lead to greater social ills. Have you guys seen those predictions come to pass?
Who hasn't, right? I mean,
oh, absolutely, yeah.
I feel like the objectification of women is just everywhere, right? I mean, somehow women, I guess, embrace that themselves, right? Because you see how some women are, in the media, at the Grammys, like how they're portraying
Grammys.
Themselves. So they're fully living it up, to just be an object, which is horrible. It's sad. But, it's everywhere, in terms of TV, music.
Which is that mixed message because women always say, I'm not just a sex toy. And then there's the objectification that sometimes they're willing participants in.
Oh, yeah. Or just like scrolling Instagram, right? It's like how many, women are just in bikinis and all these provocative angles. I mean, you could go down a rabbit hole of that, like so easily. It's everywhere. I mean, and what a bad influence it is for young girls, like that's what their dignity is and that's what their worth is.
Did you know that when the bikini first came out, the guy who designed it could not find a model to walk down the runway wearing a bikini, so he had to hire strippers to do it. It was in France in the 1920s because it was so immodest that everyone said, no way. Now it's everywhere.
Yeah. Well, we kind of obliterated the island of Bikini to test on nuclear weapons, so just thought I'd mention that.
Is there an island called Bikini?
Yeah, that's where it comes from. Yeah.
Are you serious?
Yeah, they had to bring everyone to Hawaii, and then we bombed it to test out our nuclear weapons.
Good. We should
Serious. That's where it comes from.
We should get rid of bikinis anyway. So we should bomb them all.
Anyway.
Diane, what do you think?
Yeah, so I definitely think that you can see sort of, just the lowering of moral standards as well. I mean, you just look at sort of like the rates of cohabitation and like the number of sexual partners. It skyrocketed after sort of contraception was introduced and, all of these things that he talked about.
Abortion as a use of contraception.
And so the pill is now a thing, and a lot of people are on it and all sorts of contraception. So has it made family life in any way better, richer, happier?
No, it's prevented family life.
But what about
seriously,
the married couples who would say, well, we wanted 3 children and we had 3 children and that's what they could afford. They would probably think birth control is good, right?
So?
I don't know.
How would you respond to that?
Oh, it's tough. I would probably say, first of all, hormonal birth control is very unhealthy. If you don't know, it's a carcinogen. It's terrible for your body to be pumped with artificial hormones and the environment, and you don't need this to regulate births, right? There are the natural, I guess, pauses.
Natural family planning. Yeah.
Well, not
Which
that,
we'll
but even like
future episode.
Paul the Sixth talks about it. It's God's design that there are periods of infertility naturally, right, within a woman's cycle. So if you can learn to monitor that, you can avoid procreation. But then I think the counter argument is that to say it's, well, if you learn the cycle, and so then if you're engaging in the act on this day and it's not going to lead to pregnancy, what's the difference then between doing that and being on birth control?
I've always used the example of the difference between dieting and bulimia, right? Because dieting, they both accomplish the same purpose. You lose weight, right? But one you would say is very morally legitimate and one was not morally legitimate, because if you're dieting, you say, I don't want the weight, so I'm not going to have the pleasure of eating. Mm-hmm. Versus bulimia says, I want the pleasure of eating and I don't want any consequences.
That's a good example.
Yeah, and I think that, we had a shout out to Father John Connaughton if he's listening, but we had a guest priest come to our study, and he gave a great talk sort of on, because I think one of the biggest issues, and honestly this encyclical does go into it and the study did as well, is that what is the difference between contraception and natural family planning? And it really we talk about, like, for every moral choice the church asks us three things. So to consider the object chosen, the what, the end or the intention, the why, and the means, or the circumstances of the action. And contraception is a sin against nature, and it can never be morally illicit. So it's an act that can never produce children. And the sexual act is, it's geared towards the generation of new life. So distortion of this is a sin against nature. And so we don't judge actions based on intentions or consequences. You have to look at the act itself.
Right. All three have to be good.
Mm-hmm.
The action to be good, yeah.
And if one is wrong, then, that's it. But, like contraception versus having sex during infertile time, contraception is an act that can never produce children, whereas having sex during infertile time, it can produce children. It's the type of act that can produce children, whether or not you're old or in menopause or whatever. So right. I think it's really important for people to understand sort of the those criteria for moral choice and the morality of things in order to kind of wrap their heads around church teaching.
And, Paul VI does talk about what he calls a contraceptive mentality, because I think people can do natural family planning with that mentality of, I'm just trying to avoid. Because it's about the child being seen as a gift. Is the child a gift or is the child a burden? Is this something that we accept lovingly from God, or is this something that we want to try to avoid because we think pregnancy is, a sickness? Now, there are good reasons to avoid a pregnancy. Certainly, the mother's health, financial burden on the family when you've genuinely been generous to God. But, to just do it because I only want 2 kids, I think natural family planning could be immoral, coming from that contraceptive mentality.
Yeah, and I think you also bring the point that when a couple is entering into the vocation of marriage, they know that they have to be open to life. That's part of entering into it, right? That's part of the sacrament. Maybe they don't know that, because a lot of people do think they can just get married and not have children, but that's not what the church teaches. So to go along with that, you therefore then have to put your trust in God, right?
There's definitely
that this is up to Him about when the new life is going to come and how often, how many, right? Because really He's always the one creating that life. So you may not intend to have 5 or 6 kids, but maybe that's what living out your vocation actually means.
That's true.
And oftentimes we think, right, before anything or before any challenge, we're like, how am I going to get through this? How am I going to do this? This is too much. I'm so overwhelmed. I'm stressed. I don't have enough money. Like any kind of thing that you might go through in your life. And then what happens, right? Like God leads you through it. Yeah. You don't have all the answers, but you're not meant to.
One of the families that inspires me the most, and they listen to this podcast, so shout out to them, but they have 11 kids, 10 of whom are still at home. And they live in a very small house, and they may not have the latest technology and the fine designer shoes and go on great vacations to Martha's Vineyard. But when I go over to their house, it is filled with love. Mm-hmm. It is so joyful. It's just, it inspires me so much because they're so generous. In fact, recently the mom and dad said, we're thinking about foster care.
Oh, that's amazing.
Well, I'm thinking, where are you going to put them? You got to build an attic or something. I don't know.
Oh, no, that's so beautiful. In living where we do in Fairfield County with all these huge homes everywhere, and most families have 2 kids, and you're like, wow, you could easily host, 5, 6 kids. All these kids need home throughout our country, throughout the world. And they probably have all the wealth to support 20 kids.
Yeah.
Really, but I don't know. We're kind of self-centered and we want what we want and that's it. And my boy and my girl and what's convenient to me and my lifestyle. Like, again, I don't ever want to judge, but that's the perception that comes off.
That's true. I mean, our standard of living might be lower if we have more kids, but the richness of life will be higher.
Exactly.
Satisfaction will be higher. Plus, you have more kids to take care of you when you're old.
That's what people don't think about
That's right.
when they're in their 20s and 30s.
Exactly.
That's why you have long-term care insurance, right? I mean, I don't know. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Whenever, whenever, mom and dad are like, do the dishes. Well, why don't you just get a dishwasher? Like, well, I have 5 dishwashers.
I know, right?
They're named Joe and Kathy and Steve.
Nice.
But-
And just back to that one quick thing. My dad's one of 9, 5 boys and 4 girls. 4 of the 5 boys were in their own bedroom. I think the oldest got a tiny, tiny bedroom for himself. And then the youngest, my dad got it briefly. The 4 girls were in one bedroom. They had one bathroom in the house.
Whoa.
Right?
Okay, that's hardcore.
And maybe a shower in the basement, but it was an unfinished basement.
Brr. Freezing cold.
And they grew up on a farm. They had to work hard, right? Chores before school, go to school, farm the land, farm the neighbor's land, That's like our parents' generation and beyond. And we're all just so spoiled now and so soft,
True. It's true.
Kids sitting in their beds playing on their iPads and their Nintendo Switches and Xbox and,
But they were happier than we are on the whole.
Well, there's something about hard work that's fulfilling, right? Like, gives you purpose.
I think so.
Yeah. So.
Well, I think too, like the church doesn't teach that sex is bad, and married sexual love is one of the ways that spouses image God, who's a life-giving communion of love. And what we're kind of talking about here is like it seems like the mentality nowadays is kind of everyone is like take care of myself first and not giving fully of myself. But then contraception in and of itself, like the body is telling a lie when you're basically supposed to be saying I'm giving all of myself to you completely, totally, permanently. But, really when you're sort of cutting off that procreative purpose, like you're telling a lie, and you're withholding.
Yeah.
So
that most sacred part, you're not giving fully to your spouse. Yeah. So with the couple minutes that we have left, questions for you. First of all, do you personally agree with this teaching? Because it's so controversial, and I know something like 90% of Catholic couples practice contraception. And if you do agree with the teaching, how does it apply to your life? Because none of you are married, and I'm not married. So it's easy for us to say, you got to not use contraception. But I mean, the truth is, like, I'm not married, so I'm sure it's a little different. So do you agree with it?
yes,
Yes,
100%.
I agree. Yeah.
Lauren?
Yes, I agree. When I first heard it, I was like, really? Because obviously society just says, birth control. I've never wanted it or used it for myself, but I know plenty of women who have. I didn't know that wasn't acceptable. But then from learning that, I learned more about all the negative side effects of birth control and how it causes depression and all these horrible things. And people should really not be on it.
Yeah.
But then I will say I have the privilege of being single. Again, so like if I got married at 25, I don't know what that would have looked like. I can certainly understand people who say, I can't have like 10 kids, So I don't know. It is tough. And we all have to, I guess, navigate it on our own and put it to God, trust God, seek advice,
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess for me, it's like I learned all this in 5th grade in Catholic school. Like we had a pretty conservative sex ed class, you could say.
Whoa.
Yeah, and so they said this is what it might look like when you go to public high school, because we didn't have a Catholic high school in the town, so most of us went to public high school, and they were very upfront. So it was, I don't know, for me it's just always been part of my appreciation for
That's great.
Catholic doctrine, I guess you could
Great.
say.
So, I mean, how do you live it out now as single people?
Well, don't really have to. But again, if I ever talk to anyone, who mentions anything about birth control now, I kind of try to gently be like, you may want to reconsider just for your health,
Yeah.
For me, I think it's I as a priest, I try to encourage families and make it as easy for families to have as many kids as possible. Like when a kid is screaming in church, I'm like, don't take him out. We love him here. It's a great thing. And and trying to just make things make it as easy as possible for people to feel like children are not a burden but a gift.
That's a
Yeah,
great
I think
point.
it's advising because as the one like Catholic person or outwardly Catholic person at my company, I get questions about this stuff. It's like, why is that? Why is NFP? Why is that allowed and contraception's not? Like, what's the deal with that? That doesn't make any sense. And I have to explain it as concisely as I can. But some people are just so they just don't. They're just so they've accommodated the times so much that they can't even wrap their head around it.
Yeah.
Which is a shame.
It's hard.
Yeah.
Well, we've ran out of time, but thank you so much for joining us on this episode. We will have some more episodes coming up on Humanae Vitae and the theology of the body, because that's a topic that as young adults we are wrestling with, and we're going to have to kind of deal with in our future if God's calling us to marriage or even to single life. But thank you so much for joining us. You can find us on Veritas Catholic Radio, 1350 AM, and wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in next time.